Retirement is not simply about choosing the lowest-priced home you can find. A community may be inexpensive and yet feel isolated, impractical, or too distant from the essential services you rely on. The more important question is this: where can you enjoy a peaceful lifestyle, manage your expenses comfortably, access quality healthcare, spend time in nature, and still feel that your life has grown richer rather than smaller? Music. This is where many people make the wrong assumption. The ideal retirement town is not necessarily the place with the sunniest climate or the most picture-perfect scenery. It is the place where your savings stretch further, daily tasks remain easy, healthcare is accessible, and your days feel relaxed without becoming dull. That is exactly what this list focuses on. These are Canadian towns where retirement remains practical and attainable, not luxury resort destinations, not remote villages with little to offer, and not communities that look appealing only in photographs. These are places where affordability, tranquility, community connections, healthcare availability, and day-to-day comfort combine in a way that works for people seeking a slower pace without sacrificing convenience. Number 12, Bankhead, Alberta. At its height, Bankhead had a population of roughly 1,500 people. What makes it especially bizarre is its location. It stood inside Banff National Park. In 1903, the Canadian Pacific Railway opened a coal mine at the base of Cascade Mountain, and the town that developed around it ended up being more advanced than Banff itself. It had a municipal water system, sewage infrastructure, electricity, and street lighting. While Banff was still developing, around 300 miners were working underground, pulling out nearly 200,000 tons of coal every year. The issue was that the coal was awful. It was so fragile that by the time it reached the end of processing, nearly half of it had broken apart into useless dust. Miners carved more than 185 miles of tunnels in search of something usable. In the 1920s, labor strikes finally pushed the operation over the edge, and the Canadian Pacific Railway shut the mine down in 1922. Since Bankhead was a company town, the company owned essentially everything, which meant residents had nowhere meaningful to stay and no real reason to remain. By 1926, buildings were literally being moved out of town and relocated to Banff, Canmore, and Calgary. The old railway station now sits on the grounds of the Banff Hostel. Then in 1930, the National Parks Act banned any future mining in Banff altogether. Bankhead was not just abandoned, it was legally prevented from ever returning. There is also a local story about a Chinese laundry worker named Sam Singh, who was falsely accused of murder and deported, and supposedly cursed the town before leaving. The mine shut down only weeks later. Probably a coincidence, but it is definitely a more entertaining explanation than the coal kept crumbling. Today, visitors can walk a 1-kilometer interpretive trail through the remains of Bankhead. It is family-friendly, lined with educational signs, and all the while the mountain towers overhead as if it has been quietly witnessing everything for the last century. Number 11 takes us somewhere much darker, Grosse Isle, Quebec. This is not a ghost town in the usual sense. It is more like a ghost island, and the ghosts here feel disturbingly real. Take a second to absorb this. In 1847 alone, 5,424 people were buried here, many of them in mass graves where coffins were stacked 3 layers deep. Grosse Isle lies in the St. Lawrence River, 48 kilometers downstream from Quebec City. In 1832, the government established it as a quarantine station to inspect immigrants for cholera. Over the next 105 years, more than 4 million people passed through this island before entering Canada. But 1847 became its darkest chapter. The Great Potato Famine was devastating Ireland, and close to 100,000 refugees fled to Canada aboard what came to be known as coffin ships, so named because typhus, malnutrition, and overcrowding killed so many passengers during the crossing that bodies were routinely thrown into the sea. The first ship, Syria, arrived on May 17, 1847, carrying 430 fever cases. By the end of that same month, 36 vessels were backed up in a line stretching 2 miles down the river. At one stage, 40 ships carrying 12,500 sick passengers were anchored offshore at the same time. Dr. George Douglas, the superintendent of the station, was completely overwhelmed. The medical superintendent later wrote that he had never imagined a time when every ship would arrive carrying fever the way they were now. He had no beds, no supplies, and no real means of helping the sick. The quarantine station became so overwhelmed that doctors began checking patients by simply making them walk past and stick out their tongues. Many of those who were initially judged healthy came down with fever weeks later, and ended up spreading typhus to 20,000 Canadians across the country. Robert White, who kept a diary while aboard one of the famine ships, described an endless procession of boats, each delivering its load of dead to the burial ground. Some vessels carried multiple bodies wrapped tightly in canvas, with the rigid, unmistakable shape of death clearly visible beneath the cloth. Corpses were pulled from the holds of ships using hooks, then piled along the shore like stacked firewood and buried in long trenches because digging separate graves took too much time. Today, a Celtic cross stands on Telegraph Hill looking out over those mass graves. Its inscription says, "Children of the Gael died in their thousands on this island, having fled from the laws of foreign tyrants and an artificial famine." Today, the site is preserved as a Parks Canada National Historic Site. It can be reached by boat. The meadow is rippled with raised ridges where the graves lie, and simple white crosses mark those who were never identified. Even in bright weather, the island feels heavy. The gulls cry overhead and the rain taps softly across the ground. Over 7,480 people are buried there. And this is not some distant, forgotten chapter of history. The descendants of orphaned children who were taken in by Quebec families still live throughout the heart of the province. The island has held onto the memory of what the rest of us allowed ourselves to forget. Now moving on to something far less grim. Number 10 is Rowley, Alberta. Population 12, and even that might be a generous estimate depending on who you ask. Rowley began as a railway town in 1912. At its peak, around 500 residents lived there, supporting the farms and ranches scattered across the surrounding prairie. Then rail service ended, the Depression arrived, and drought pushed farmers out. The familiar pattern. By the 1980s, the town was basically abandoned. But what makes Rowley different from most dying prairie towns is what happened next. The few residents who remained decided to embrace the situation completely. Instead of letting the town fade away, they turned it into a movie set. Superman III was filmed there. Bye Bye Blues was filmed there. Commercials and smaller productions have used the town as well. The locals actually maintain the buildings specifically for film crews. They even dress mannequins and place them around town, turning the place into a strange kind of performance piece built around its own decline. Visitors can walk through the old general store, the bank, and the churches, all preserved in the early 20th century style that production designers love. There is something darkly amusing about a town that watched its population fall by 98% and responded by deciding that, at the very least, it should look good on camera. The funny complication is that Rowley is not really a ghost town anymore. It is more like a living theme park run by its 12 remaining residents, which creates some philosophical questions about authenticity that I am not qualified to settle. What Rowley does offer is easy road access, well-preserved buildings, and an atmosphere that still feels unmistakably prairie. What it asks in return is that you accept you are visiting a place fully aware that it has become a tourist attraction, and that it has made peace with that role. The downsides are obvious. There are no services, no accommodations, and if you arrive hopping for eerie solitude, you may find a film crew instead. But if you want to see what a small prairie town looked like in 1920 without the hassle of inventing time travel, Rowley absolutely delivers. Is it a ghost town? In a way. Is it a museum? Also kind of. Is it a peculiar little community surviving almost entirely on charm and stubbornness? Without question. Number 9 is where things become genuinely unsettling. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. At its peak, the surrounding region held around 5,000 people, with roughly 2,500 living in the city itself by 1981. Today, the population is about 70, and the only way in is by air because there is no road access. Here is what makes Uranium City so striking. It helped fuel the nuclear arms race. During the 1950s, it was the center of Cold War uranium mining in Canada, and in the 1960s and 1970s it became one of the key pillars of the country's nuclear ambitions. The government deliberately planned it as a showcase mining community, complete with award-winning houses, modern infrastructure, and facilities built for a population of 5,000 people. It even had a high school named Candu. The town's high school was even named after Canada's nuclear reactor. The future looked radioactive, and Uranium City was making money hand over fist from it. Then everything collapsed on December 3, 1981, when Eldorado Nuclear announced on CBC radio that the Beaver Lodge mine would shut down in 6 months. There was no warning, no public discussion, no consultation, just a radio announcement. Dean Klassen, who still lives in Uranium City today, remembers that moment clearly. He says the closure was announced over the radio, and in an instant the entire town lost its jobs. House prices fell to zero overnight. Children in school were crying that very day. Some families had only recently arrived. Homes that had been built to stand for generations became worthless in the span of a single morning. By June 1982, around 90% of the population had left. Some flew out by jet, while many others used the ice road that was open for only 6 weeks. Water and sewer services were cut off to the outer parts of town, and the people who stayed behind retreated into an ever-shrinking central area. Kandu High School, which had opened in 1979 full of optimism and expectation, shut down in 1983 after surviving just 4 years and producing only 3 graduating classes. Today, Dean Klassen walks through those abandoned corridors and says, "I still see my friends running up and down the hallways. If you focus only on all the destruction and everything that's missing, you miss it. I look at the good things." When he flies into Uranium City now, he says it still feels like coming home. That is both deeply touching and quietly brutal. The buildings are falling apart. The infrastructure is breaking down. You cannot even get home insurance there anymore. But for the roughly 70 people who still remain, it is still their town. Uranium City is not fully dead. It is something almost worse than that, dying in slow motion while the rest of the world watches. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and we are constantly working to make these videos even better. Number 8 brings us to Sandon, British Columbia. Peak population, 5,000. Current population, a few stubborn residents and some very bewildering trolley buses. Let's be honest about Sandon. Back in the 1890s, this place was the silver capital of Canada. It had 29 hotels, 28 saloons, its own stock exchange, and electric lights before Vancouver had them. 5,000 people were living in a remote mountain valley because silver was apparently worth more than common sense. The boom lasted about as long as you would expect. Silver prices crashed, miners moved on, and by the early 20th century Sandon was already in decline. Then in 1955, a flood wiped out most of the buildings that were still standing. Nature effectively handed the town its final eviction notice. But this is where the story turns strange. In the 1980s, someone began collecting abandoned trolley buses from Vancouver and parking them in Sandon. The apparent goal was to restore them. They were not restored. They are still sitting there. Rows of rusting trolley buses from the 1940s and 1950s now stand in a ghost town filled with storefronts from the 1890s. It is 3 separate eras of abandonment layered into one place: the silver boom, the flood destruction, and the failed trolley restoration project. It is almost too neat as a metaphor. What Sandon offers is easy access. Unlike many ghost towns in British Columbia, you can simply drive right up to it. The old wooden buildings tilt at worrying angles. Rusting mining machinery lies scattered in the forest. A creek cuts through what used to be Main Street. The place has atmosphere in excess. The problem is that almost nothing is truly being preserved. The buildings are collapsing, the trolley buses are rusting away, and there is no interpretive center, no entry fee, and no carefully managed visitor experience. You are basically wandering through a site that is actively decaying in real time. Wear solid shoes, be cautious around unstable structures. And maybe pause for a second to appreciate the irony that Sandon had electric lighting in 1892 and now consists of little more than empty storefronts, dead trolley buses, and the creek that helped destroy it. Progress is not always a straight line. Sometimes it moves in reverse. Number 7 is Jalbert, Quebec. Peak population, 950. This one genuinely surprises people because it may be the best preserved ghost town in all of Canada, and you can actually stay there overnight. 1901, entrepreneur Damis Jalbert built a pulp mill at the base of Ouyachuan Falls. The waterfall is 72 meters high, taller than Niagara Falls. The energy it produced allowed Jalbert to build what was essentially a model company town, decades ahead of its era. Workers here had electricity and indoor plumbing at a time when much of rural Quebec was still relying on outhouses and oil lamps. They were also paid double the standard wage. People in the surrounding region looked at Jalbert with envy. Buildings rose quickly: homes, a general store, a convent school, and the enormous mill at the center of it all. By 1926, Jalbert was flourishing. Then on August 13, 1927, it was finished. Demand for untreated mechanical pulp collapsed, the mill shut down, and because Jalbert was a company town, there was no real reason for anyone to remain. One person who had lived there as a child later said it was the first time they had ever seen their parents cry. Within just 2 years, the entire village had been abandoned. The priests and nuns left on September 15, 1929. The company ordered every house to be boarded up. And then something unusual happened. Quebec decided to preserve it. The provincial government took control of the site in 1949 after the company failed to pay its taxes. In 1960, it opened to tourists, making it one of the earliest ghost town preservation efforts in Canada. Today, visitors can walk through streets lined with French names, look into decaying homes with trees pushing up through the roofs, step inside the restored general store, and watch the 72-meter waterfall roar past silent roads. More than $19 million has been invested in reviving the site. There is now a cable car leading to a glass observation platform above the falls, a restaurant inside the old mill, and yes, you can even book a night in restored 1920s-era houses, literally paying to sleep inside a ghost town. There is something a little unsettling about that. It is tourism built on loss, business built on the remains of a dead community. But Jalbert avoided the fate that swallowed most ghost towns. It was not destroyed by fire, not drowned, and not scrubbed from the map. Instead, it was sealed in time and handed back to us as heritage. Whether that counts as preservation or exploitation probably depends on how you feel about souvenir shops inside the same general store where children once bought candy before watching their parents break down in tears. Numbers 6 and 5 are both in Newfoundland, and honestly they are really part of the same devastating story, so it makes sense to talk about them together. Great Paradise reached a peak population of 197. It was founded in 1758 and abandoned in 1967. Ireland's Eye was home to several dozen families. It was settled during the 1700s and abandoned in 1966. Both communities became casualties of Joey Smallwood's resettlement programs. To understand what happened, you need to understand Newfoundland itself. Between 1954 and 1975, the government relocated about 30,000 people from more than 300 different communities. That was roughly 10% of the province's entire population. The official argument was that small, scattered outport settlements were no longer economically sustainable. They were too expensive to service, and the idea was that people needed to be moved into larger growth centers, where jobs would supposedly appear through spin-off industries. Families were offered $1,000 plus $200 for each dependent to walk away from homes their families had occupied for generations. But there was a catch. In order for anyone to receive the money, 80 to 90% of the community had to agree to resettle. Think about the pressure that created. Your neighbors needed your vote in favor, otherwise they could not afford to leave. Entire communities that had existed for 200 years were torn apart through a democratic process that gave people the appearance of choice while steadily removing any real alternative. Great Paradise had survived since 1758, more than 2 centuries. After resettlement, the famous red church spire remained standing by itself for decades, visible for miles out at sea, like a monument to everything that had been erased. The government even went so far as to remove resettled communities from official maps so they could not quietly drift back into existence. At Ireland's Eye, many families refused to simply leave their houses behind. Instead, they floated entire homes across the bay on oil drums because the resettlement payment was nowhere near enough to replace what they were giving up. A house was worth far more than $1,000. Hayward Blake, who was resettled from Pushthrough when he was 13 years old, later said he had heard many stories from people who dropped out of school or were bullied after moving to their new communities. One woman told him that once her family resettled, other students turned her into the laughingstock of the school. She eventually quit and went to work at the fish plant. Her entire life path changed because of that move. Researchers later found the same sentiment over and over again. People would say, "He didn't exactly force us out, but he left us no choice." And the so-called growth centers never really became what they were promised to be. Many of them simply turned into unemployment traps. Today, those abandoned outports are among the most breathtaking coastal landscapes in North America. Tourists now pay money to visit the same places the government once paid people to leave. Number 4 is Ocean Falls, British Columbia. At its peak in 1950, the town had a population of 3,500. Today, that number sits somewhere between 25 and 35, depending on who you ask. It receives roughly 173 inches of rain every year. That is 4,390 millimeters for anyone keeping score in metric. Ocean Falls is one of the wettest places anywhere in North America. The people who still live there call themselves the Rain People. Back in 1906, a pulp and paper company looked at all that water and saw opportunity. The falls provided cheap hydroelectric power, and the water coming from Link Lake was so pure that it required no filtering to produce white paper, something almost unheard of in the industry. By 1917, the mill had become the largest in British Columbia, turning out newsprint at a speed of 600 feet per minute. For decades, Ocean Falls somehow managed to thrive despite being in a location that made almost no sense. The only ways in were by boat or float plane. The rain was constant, but the company supplied everything people needed: housing, a hospital, schools, and even the second largest hotel in British Columbia. It became a close, tightly connected community held together by shared isolation and perpetual dampness. Then in 1973, Crown Jalbert decided to shut the mill down. The provincial government bought the operation for almost nothing and tried to keep it alive. But by 1980 they finally gave up. By then the population had already collapsed from 3,500 to fewer than 100 people. Buildings began giving way under the endless assault of rain. The old mill, the hotel, the homes, everything people had built slowly started surrendering to moisture and time. There is a cruel irony in that. The same water that powered the mill and made the paper so pure is now the force destroying the town itself. And yet Ocean Falls is not completely dead. The dam still produces electricity. Around 30 residents still remain. The old bank continues to operate for visitors. And in one of the stranger twists in this entire story, the town now hosts a Bitcoin mining operation powered by surplus hydroelectric energy. A piece of 21st century technology running on 20th century industrial infrastructure. You can still visit Ocean Falls by BC Ferries, which stops there on the route between Bella Coola and Bella Bella. The mill building still looms over the town, empty and silent. The boardwalks continue to rot. The rain keeps falling endlessly. And somewhere among the ruins, computers are busy mining cryptocurrency. Former Premier John Horgan, who once worked at the mill as a university student, probably never saw that coming. Even he could not save the place. Number 3 is Silver City, Yukon. Number 2 is Antioch, British Columbia, Canada's largest ghost town. We are grouping them together because they build toward something even bigger. Silver City had a population of several hundred at its height. Today it has none. It was one of those Klondike-era settlements that sprang into existence after gold was discovered in the region in 1903. For about 2 decades, people genuinely believed they could sustain a permanent town there through mining. They were wrong. The ore ran out, the location was too remote, and by the 1920s everyone had left. What makes Silver City so haunting is how little effort was ever made to preserve it. Shelves still sit lined with rusting cans. Abandoned trucks are slowly sinking back into the earth. Pink fireweed grows up through collapsed floors. No one cleaned the place out. No one hauled anything away. People simply walked off and left the Yukon to reclaim the rest. It feels like the Klondike dream caught in the act of rotting. Every ounce of hope and ambition oxidized into scrap. But Antioch is something else entirely. Antioch was huge. At its peak it had around 3,000 residents. In 1914, at the height of its power, it was one of the biggest communities in all of British Columbia. This was a copper mining town with a hospital, a golf course, a curling rink, tennis courts, and even the tallest dam in Canada. Over the course of 25 years, its mines produced 340,000 tons of copper, 230 tons of silver, and 4 tons of gold. Pollution was almost biblical. Smelter workers were nicknamed gas eaters because the fumes were so intense. Some of them could not stay on the job for more than 2 hours at a time. Residents had to plan when to hang laundry based on wind direction so it would not be coated in black soot. When the air was still, the entire town suffered nosebleeds. And the children, they reportedly made a game out of setting the snow on fire. The sulfur contamination was so severe that the snow could literally burn. Pause on that for a second. Even the light bulbs tell you something about the place. Workers kept stealing them, so the company had the word stolen etched into the glass. Today, those same bulbs are prized by collectors as historical artifacts. By 1935, the Great Depression had destroyed copper prices. 50 million kilograms of unsold copper, 3 full years of production were stacked at the harbor with nowhere to go and no buyers willing to take them. On July 31, 1935, the mine closed. In a single stroke, everyone lost their homes. Peter Leyden, Peter Leyden, who was born in Antioch in 1930, later wrote that the town had entered the world quietly, but left it with an explosion, or at least with the explosion that signaled its final chapter. Lightning sparked fires in 1942 and 1943 destroyed every wooden building still standing. During the war, all usable metal was stripped away for salvage. What remains today are only concrete ruins and steel frames. Just 2 permanent residents still live there. The rust-colored tailings fields support little more than stunted trees and carnivorous plants. Reaching Antioch is difficult. You can only get there by boat or float plane. It is the largest ghost town in Canada and almost nobody can actually visit it. And finally, number 1, Kitsault, British Columbia. Peak population 1,200. Total time occupied before complete abandonment 18 months. Cost of construction $250 million, more than $800 million in today's dollars. And yes, it is every bit as ridiculous as that sounds. In 1979, the Phelps Dodge Corporation built an entire instant town from the ground up to house workers for a molybdenum mine. This was not some rough camp. It was a fully formed community, 100 houses, apartment buildings, a shopping mall, a swimming pool, a curling rink, a hospital, a theater, everything a town was supposed to need. Entire families moved their lives there. Betty McCormack, her husband Ben, and their 3 daughters were among the first residents to arrive in early 1981. The company covered their moving expenses. The place seemed to have everything. In April 1982, the shopping mall held its ribbon-cutting ceremony. Only weeks later, the mine announced it was suspending operations because molybdenum prices had collapsed. By November 1982, that suspension became permanent. Eviction notices went out. In July 1983, Betty McCormack told the Vancouver Sun, "We love it here, it's a great little community, it's a shame it had to shut down." Residents were ordered to be gone by Halloween, October 31, 1983. Most families had already left by then. The school was loaded onto a barge and sent to Kamloops. Modular homes were shipped away to Terrace and Alberta. On October 1, 1983, dozens of neighbors gathered at the Maple Leaf Pub for one final drink together. They signed their names on a document and taped it to the wall. That document is still there. On November 10, 1983, Larry Pajak and Reg Peary became the final 2 people to leave Kitsault. A sign asked the last person to please switch off the lights. They did not. The lights are still on. In 2005, Indian-Canadian businessman Krishnan Suthanthurn purchased the entire town for $5.7 million, less than 3% of what it had cost to build. He renamed it after his late mother. Since then he has spent more than $25 million maintaining it. He keeps 10 caretakers on payroll to mow the lawns, repair roofs, and replace light bulbs for a population of 0. The swimming pool is still clean. The hospital still contains barely used medical equipment. The library still has due date cards from 1982. There is still an ashtray in the hospital waiting room. Curling trophies still have empty bronze plates where winners' names were meant to be engraved for bonspiels that were planned but never actually happened. In 2023, Suthanthurn said, "I would say that you will see Kitsault thriving within the next 10 years. By that point, he had owned it for 20 years. The town itself has been empty for more than 40. In 2022, he closed it entirely to the public. Though Kitsault remains where it is, deep in the wilderness of northern British Columbia, spotless, preserved, and waiting for residents who will probably never come. It is a $250 million monument to the belief that prosperity lasts forever. It is a reminder that communities can disappear far faster than anyone expects, and it is an extraordinarily expensive ghost town where the lights are still burning, maintained by a man who still believes in a future that may never arrive." If there is one thing worth taking from these 12 stories, maybe it is this. Every one of these places was once somebody's main street, somebody's childhood home, somebody's entire universe. They had grocery stores, schools, and neighbors who knew each other by name. The speed with which they were emptied out and forgotten should disturb anyone who assumes their own community is permanent. Because the forces that created these ghost towns have not vanished. They are still here. They are just waiting for the next commodity crash, the next corporate decision, the next government policy that quietly decides some communities matter and others do not. And when that moment comes, somebody may once again be the last person told to turn off the lights. Or maybe like Kitsault, they will leave them on just in case.